Secretary of State Antony Blinken honored the International Day of Democracy a few weeks ago, writing on X, "Democracy depends on the free and open exchange of ideas, including online. On this International Day of Democracy, I call on governments around the world to protect citizens' access to information that allows them to make informed decisions."
Political commentator Russell Brand and the Gray Zone's Aaron Mate discussed a tweet on Russell Brand's show last week.
I can't believe the gall of this guy. He is presiding over the persecution of a publisher whose only crime was that he exposed state crimes. That's all Julian Assange did. He released he didn't steal it himself. He was given cables and war logs, which he released through WikiLeaks. He exposed state crimes. And for that, he gets persecuted, tortured, locked in a cage with no end in sight. Now he's facing extradition to the U.S. And Antony Blinken has the gall to say he cares about democracy and media freedom and free expression. And that's just what you can do when you don't have a media that does its job, when it doesn't point out the hypocrisies, the glaring hypocrisies right in front of us. And so Blinken can get away with pretending that he cares about media freedom because you rarely, if ever, see him being questioned about, for example, imprisoning Julian Assange.
Joining us now to weigh in is organizer, writer, and contributor at the Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, Bryce Greene. Bryce, thanks for joining us again. Bryce, what are your initial thoughts on Blinken? I mean, I was just telling Brianna he was playing the bass guitar, I think, a week ago, and it was going viral on Twitter. He was like, "Oh my God, we love him, we love him." And I thought, what does this have to do with his actual job, though?
Right. Well, my initial thoughts are, well, this is exactly the sort of thing that Antony Blinken has been doing since he became Secretary of State. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly the sort of thing the Biden administration has been doing since they came into office. They make allusions to how much they care about freedom, democracy, and liberty, while simultaneously taking extreme steps to curtail those liberties. The case of Julian Assange is one of the easiest examples that you can point to when you talk about how the U.S. government and how the Biden administration specifically is an extreme hypocrite. As Aaron Mate said, Assange is just a publisher. If the U.S. is successfully able to prosecute Julian Assange for this sort of thing, for just publishing documents that were leaked to him, then they can prosecute the New York Times for the exact same thing. And this idea that they're committed to allowing citizens to have information that can allow them to make informed decisions is, of course, just nonsense. One of the other things that Aaron alluded to in that clip, I don't know if you showed it here, but he was talking about how Biden recently went to the UN and was talking about how Russia was dismantling all these ballistic missile treaties, the INF treaty, and the like. Meanwhile, the media and everyone in the administration, they simply allow him to spout that lie without acknowledging that it was the Trump administration who actually got out of those treaties. And it was the Biden administration who refused to even talk about getting into those treaties. And this issue is more pernicious when you think about it, when you consider the origins of this Ukraine war. It's not talked about in the American press. It's not talked about in the media a lot. But one of the core concerns that led Russia to invade Ukraine was NATO expansion. And, well, what that means is that NATO has the ability to put missiles into Ukraine. And if you go back and look at public statements from Putin and others, one of the worries was that missiles from Ukraine could reach Moscow in 7 or even 5 minutes, completely upending the balance of power that defined the nuclear age. This was all dropped from the American media. This is all allowed to pass under the table. This idea that Blinken cares about giving citizens information that they can make informed decisions is completely nonsense.
I think that's a really interesting point. I've seen a kind of a supercut going around the internet the last few days by a popular videographer, Matt Orff, that put together all of the instances of mainstream pundits, talking heads, making the case that anyone who pointed to NATO expansion as one of the inciting factors of the Russian invasion were simply being Putin puppets, contrasted with now NATO head Jens Stoltenberg recently saying, I think just last month, that NATO enlargement was a factor there. So you really do see how manufacturing consent goes a really far way to informing the public opinion. And yet we do live in a world where, despite all of the, let's say, for lack of a better word, propaganda that we get out of the mainstream media, you do have a majority of the public disfavoring additional spending to Ukraine. And I do wonder what you think the role of independent media and organizations like FAIR, which you write for, are playing in counterbalancing what we're hearing from the mainstream.
All right. Well, I'm proud to be a writer and contributor to fairness and accuracy in reporting because I think the job that they do, the role that they have in society is so important. If we can't trust our mainstream media organizations who claim to be on the side of informing the public, who claim to be, the arbiters of facts and truth, who can give people a coherent view of the world, if we can't rely on them to actually do that job, well, there need to be alternative institutions that are capable of informing people when those institutions are lying to us. And really, that's what they're doing. Every time any pundit, any talking head, any journalist got on TV or wrote on their respective outlet that NATO expansion was not a primary cause of this war, they were lying. Well, either they were lying or they were simply ignorant. And in either case, you cannot rely on those people to actually inform you about what's going on. And I was writing about this even before the war started, how NATO expansion was a major touch point for Putin's actions and Putin's demands that NATO stop expanding or at least start talking about these sorts of things. Meanwhile, the U.S. was refusing to negotiate, and they've known for years that this would eventually push Russia into some dramatic action. Pentagon studies even pointed out that, keeping up U.S. support for Ukraine would lead Moscow to invade. So they knew that this would happen. And yet, when the war started, everyone and their mothers started talking about how this war was unprovoked and completely, out of the blue. But they knew that was not the case, and yet they told the public that anyway.
Bryce, how long are we supposed to continue to subsidize this war? I mean, it's not like we're doing what we did in World War II, where we're saying, well, this is essentially a loan that has to be paid back over an agreed amount of time. And so a lot of people look at $100+ billion and continuing, with some even wanting there to be more. And they're asking themselves, well, how much? How long? When do we stop? Are they paying this back? What about some of the other issues that the country is experiencing itself financially? Well, what's your take on that?
Well, my understanding of it is that while most Americans are opposed to more Ukraine aid, the establishment is almost completely on board with it. There are only a few Republicans in their own little, their caucus, their Freedom Caucus, I believe it's called, who are opposing more aid to Ukraine. And they're not doing it because they care about the Ukrainian people or they want peace or anything. They're just concerned about China. But one of the core reasons that the U.S. does continue, the mainstream establishment, the beltway that is defined by the military-industrial complex and the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, is that funding Ukraine, not only does it advance U.S. strategic interests by weakening Russia, by bogging them down in what's more and more called Russia's own Vietnam, but it also means that every dollar we give to Ukraine is a sizable chunk of that dollar ends up going right back to American military industrial complex actors. And so when we're spending money in Ukraine, a lot of that's just going back to our defense industry, our military industry, the war profiteers. That's pretty much how the U.S. economy has operated since World War II. But this isn't, again, talked about much in the U.S. press because their job isn't to inform you about these things. They don't want you to have informed opinion about these things.
Even worse, I saw a talking head. I want to say it was Jen Psaki, but don't quote me on that. But someone on MSNBC or CNN who was actually making the case that we shouldn't be upset about funding to Ukraine because it ends up back in the pockets of defense manufacturers in Alabama or Arkansas, wherever they're headquartered. Like, don't worry about sending money to Ukraine because actually it comes back to the United States of America and it's going into American pockets, as though we weren't warned 60 years ago about the vagaries of the military-industrial complex. Bryce, thank you as always for joining us here. You've been really illuminating.
Very happy to be here, Bree.